Waxing and rubbing out. Okay, what is hard wax and how does it compare to things like varnish? There's a whole range of waxes. Most of the waxes that we use and are familiar with are natural. They either come from plants or animals. So we go from a range. As it turns out, the softest of all the waxes we use comes from an animal, and it's called beeswax, and it's made by bees. The hardest of all the waxes is a plant wax called carnauba wax. And in between, there are others. The second hardest wax, by the way, is also made by an animal, and it's called shellac wax. It is a natural wax that occurs in shellac, and we take it out because it makes the shellac more clear to get the wax out of it. The wax is put in there by the little insect that creates shellac, and that is the second hardest wax of the waxes we use. So we talk about this range of hardnesses in wax, but in fact, that range is about this big. So you can easily stick your thumbnail into the softest wax, and you can pretty much stick your thumbnail into the hardest wax. Wax is not that hard. It is not as durable as any of the film forming finishes, or at least most of the film forming finishes. So compared to a well formulated varnish, there's not going to be a whole lot of comparison. So number one, wax does not have good heat resistance. Why? Because just like shellac and lacquer, it's an amorphous solid and it'll melt when something hot goes on it. So wax does not, I don't care how hard the wax is, doesn't have good heat resistance. It does not have good solvent resistance. There are a lot of common chemicals that will dissolve it, including, by the way, paint thinner, mineral spirits, naphtha, things like that. Number three, because it's so soft, it does not have good scratch resistance. Okay, these are three of the top things that we look for: chemical resistance, heat resistance, scratch resistance. It does, in fact, have decent stain resistance and it sheds water. But how does it compare to varnishes? Not particularly well, because most of the varnishes we formulate are much better at all of the things that we typically ask the finish on a tabletop to do and to tolerate. So is wax a good durable finish? No. Are there times where it's an appropriate finish? Yes, of course, absolutely. Art turnings that are really not going to be used, that sit on a shelf and get handled, are very often waxed, and there's no problem with that. That's perfectly adequate. Nobody's going to put a hot coffee pot on your art hollow form, and nobody's going to spill on it, and nobody's going to scratch it, I hope. So, yes, there are plenty of times. I've even seen picture frames done in wax for the same reason. There's no durability issues with that. So when you choose a finish, you choose it by what you want it to put up with. Wax doesn't put up with a whole lot, but if the parameters of what you need fall within the strengths of wax, then that's fine. Okay, that's fine. You don't need to overkill a finish, but you do need to understand what you want it to do and pick the finish that will do that. How do you find out things like that? Well, in almost all of my books, certainly in these two, there are charts. Let me see if I can find one of these. And the chart is like this. It says choosing a finish. You see that chart? And it tells you what the finish is, what you thin it with, what type of finish it forms, either evaporative or reactive, and then it talks about its durability, stain resistance, heat resistance, and flammability. So going by that chart, you can say, here are the things that matter to me. Let's line them up. Which finish has most of those or all of those? Bingo, you have the finish you want to use. So that chart is in at least three of my four books, and maybe in all four. I don't know. I don't read the damn things. I just so there you go. You can look that stuff up and figure it out. And I know this is putting a lot on you. It's saying to you that if you really want to make wise decisions about finishing, you have to know a bit about the finishes. But that's really true of everything, isn't it? If you want to make wise decisions about buying a car, you really need to know a bit about it. And you have to choose what's appropriate for what you want. If you want to haul wood, you'll probably want a pickup truck, not a sports car. If you want to pick up dates, you might want something a little sportier and not a pickup truck. But it's the same way with finishes. You got to start with what is it that I want it to do and which one is likely to do the things I care about. And just like you have to do a little bit of research in buying appliances and cars, you're going to have to do a little bit of research on buying finishes as well. I'm sorry. I would like to make it really easy, but and it was at one time there were only a few finishes. Now there are so many of them and so many different iterations that it's become more complicated. It's like ordering coffee at Starbucks. You actually have to know something. Order coffee, or else they'll really sneer at you. They'll spit in your coffee.
I don't know about that, but they sneer.
They do sneer. All right, and I can say that because you're all from this area and you understand that, when you move to this area, you must become a coffee maven or you're a pariah. That's your choices. Is there a simple way to get a finish to look and feel good after the last coat? Yes, there is. However, you really need to start with a decently applied finish. If you put something on that's really egregious, you're going to have a hell of a hard time getting it to look good and be smooth. But assuming that you did a decent job of putting the finish on and you get all done and you look at it and you say, well, I brushed the last coat and there's some dust nibs in it. I'd like to get rid of them. Or there's a little bit of orange peel, or I'd like it to be smoother. The simple way is something called rubbing out. And there's a whole bunch of different ways to rub out finishes with a whole bunch of different materials. I'll tell you my two favorites. If I'm rubbing out a satin finish, then what I'll do is I'll take very, very fine sandpaper, 400 or above, and I'll lightly deburr it. So if there's any dust nibs, I'll cut them off with the sandpaper until the surface is smooth. I don't have to degloss it, it just has to be smooth. Then I'll take 4/0 steel wool and paste wax. I'll show you some paste wax. This stuff. Good old run-of-the-mill paste wax. This is Johnson's. I happen to like Johnson's and Butcher's. They're my two favorites. Bry Wax, BRIWX, is another good brand, a high quality brand. There are decent waxes out there. All right, so I'm going to take this. What did I do with my opener? Did I stick it somewhere? There it is. I'm going to take this wax and I'll take my nice smooth surface and I'm going to take my 4/0 steel wool and dip it in, and then I'm going to take a nice big pad of steel wool. Let's say I'm doing a tabletop. I'm going to put the wax on the pad and I'm going to go back and forth like this. Once up and once back is one pass. On a tabletop, I typically do 6 passes. As soon as I'm done, I wipe off all the excess wax. Do not let it dry. You do not want to let the wax dry or try and buff it. I'll wipe it off and then I'll de-wax it. I'll take a clean piece of steel wool. I'll sprinkle cold water and it'll beat up. And then I take the piece of steel wool and just one light pass. And what that will do is the cold water will help congeal the wax and allow the steel wool to pull off all of the excess wax. What you really want is a molecularly thin layer of wax. So don't worry about taking off all the wax. You won't be able to do that. It's not possible. But you want it so thin that when you do this, it doesn't smear or make a mark. And the cold water and clean steel wool will do it. Having said that, let me just say a word about steel wool. All steel wools are not the same. I'm going to show you, if I can find them in here, I'm going to show you two different steel wools, and I'm going to show you the difference between them and why you would buy one rather than the other. Give me just a second to pull these off the shelf. Both of these are the same grade of steel wool. They're 4/0 steel wool. They're the same grade, and I want you to look at them. Look at this one. And I don't know if you can see this. And then look at, where's the end of this? Then look at this one.
Oh, yeah.
These are both 4/0 steel wool, but look at the difference between them. You see this? This is what I use. This is what you get in the hardware store. Why? What's the difference between them if they're both 4/0? It has to do with uniformity and consistency. This is inconsistent. So there are some thicker pieces of steel wool and some thinner ones. And that's going to give me uneven scratch pattern. This is more uniform, and it's going to give me a very even and uniform scratch pattern. So yeah, buy good steel wool. What is this? This particular one is Liberon. The other advantage of this particular steel wool is that some commercial steel wools, not all, but some, have oil on them. They use oil in the process to make steel wool. This stuff is clean, it's oil free. So sometimes that matters, sometimes it doesn't. But yeah, the sort of steel wool you buy makes a big difference. So get good steel wool, and then you do your rubbing out process. I will tell you that all of these things, everything I've taught you today, is described in more depth with more pictures in the various videos I've done and in the books I've written. So if you need to go into more depth, I think of the ones that are out there, I think these two are probably your best starting books. This one is set up like a basic course, a textbook of finishing. So it starts, the first chapter is choosing a finish. That's how you start. Then tools of the trade, stripping, preparing the wood, coloring wood, sealers, primers, and fillers, application, repairing damage, and then finally a whole chapter on rubbing out the finish. This one's done a little bit differently. This is wood finishing fixes over 175 answers to over 175 most frequently asked questions. I just compiled the most common questions. Each page is a new question, sometimes two to a page, but every page starts a new question. And there's a simple answer, one line, and a more in-depth answer if you need the more in-depth answer. All right, so that was satin. What if you want a gloss finish? Rubbing out a gloss finish is decidedly more difficult and more time consuming. Number one, the finish has to be fully cured. Well, what does that mean? Well, it depends on the finish. For lacquer, it's going to take about, depending on the lacquer, 3 to 6 weeks before it is cured enough to be able to buff up easily. Do it before that and you find you're chasing your tail. It's like trying to polish rubber. Oil-based varnish or oil-based polyurethane is going to take from 6 weeks to 3 months, depending on what it is and how thick you put it on and how much drying time you left between coats. But it really has to go a long time before you can buff it to gloss. Because of that, we typically use special finishes when we're doing high gloss finishes. And we usually use finishes that cure much more quickly. So how do you do that? Well, your first step is to sand and sand and sand. You sand as smooth as you possibly can. Go up through the grits. So you'll probably start with, let's say you have a really nice smooth last coat and you say, I can start with 400 or 500. And then you move up 600 and 1,000 and 1,200 and possibly higher. Now, let me warn you, not all sandpaper is graded in the same numbering system. So when you see Japanese abrasives with numbers like 12,000, that is not the same numbering system that we use for our sandpaper. Even with sandpapers, certain ones use different grading systems. If you use a sandpaper, say a 600 cami or ANSI, it's about equivalent to a 1,200 FIPA. So it's a complicated field, but pick one company of sandpaper that you like and go up through the grits and get that as smooth as you can. Why? Because it's a whole lot easier to get that finish smooth with sandpaper than it is with rubbing compound or polishing compound. Once you get it as smooth as you can get it, you switch to rubbing compound, which is a little bit coarser. Then you follow that with polishing compound. You can do those by hand if you want, or you can use a buffer, or you can use a buffing jack, which is a big wheel on a motor. But one way or another, it's going to take a good bit of rubbing. What you want from the polishing compound is to remove all the scratches that you can see. By now, you should be saying, wait a minute, what does the polishing compound actually do? And the answer is, it's an abrasive. Well, doesn't an abrasive leave scratches by definition? Yes, it does. Well, then how can you be adding scratches and yet get to the point where you can't see any scratches? It's a quirk of light. Here's the deal. We can see scratches if the width of that scratch is more than 1/2 the size of the light under which it is viewed. Okay, I know this is complicated, so I'll give you an example. Let's say we take a light source that's about 700 nanometers, right? And we have a scratch that's only 200 nanometers. You're not going to see the scratch. You'll see it as full gloss because that's less than half of the wavelength of 700 nanometers. Now let's go and look at it with a different light source that's, say, only 300 nanometers. And yes, we have those. Now, all of a sudden, those scratches will show up. So if you're going to view it under that light source, you need to get finer or smaller scratches. So that's why we can use an abrasive like rubbing compound or polishing compound and yet end up with something that's glossy and completely scratch free. It's because we can't see it. Fortunately, we have limitations. Our eyes have limitations, and they work with the light source to provide us with something we can or cannot see. By the way, the same thing happens with certain types of pigments. If the pigment is small enough, you can mix it into a finish and it looks translucent. Then if you suddenly change the light source, and now the pigment relative to the light source is more than half the size, it'll start turning opaque. You might have heard people who look at violin varnishes under a black light, which is a very short wavelength light. And sure enough, sometimes the colorant will become more opaque or hazy, or it'll go from red to pink. And that lets you know what sort of pigment was used on that particular finish. And sometimes we want to do this to be able to recreate authentic finishes. And sometimes we want to do it because we're concerned about the wavelength of light that something is going to be viewed under. So all of that is light and how we see it. It affects color, and yes, it also affects scratches. So for high gloss, you want to rub out as fine as you can so that the scratches are smaller than what your eye can see. Are they still there? Yep, they're still there, but you won't see them, and that's really all that matters. Okay. The last question I have on here, when is it best to refinish by sanding down to the wood? Um, there's actually a number of times that it's best to do that. One is that if you don't want to expose yourself to the chemicals in strippers, or if you don't have the facility to do that. Another is if you have a very thin finish that's already flaking off. Sometimes it's quicker to sand it off. Another reason you might want to sand off a finish rather than remove it chemically is if you want to only go down so far. So for instance, I want to remove the finish, but I don't want to remove the pore filler. Well, a chemical stripper is going to take out both. It'll remove the finish and the pore filler. But if you sand it, you can sand it down to raw wood and still leave the pores filled, and one of your jobs is already done for you. So there are situations where it's more practical to sand. A lot of that has to do with you and how you like to work. Um, it also has to do with the location of where the piece is. There are some locations where you just don't want to be using stripper. Vertical situations in homes where you can practically sand it and absorb the dust a lot more easily. Usually it's quicker to strip a finish with chemicals, but look at your own situation and see what it is. Are there situations where you'd be better off just sanding? Yeah, absolutely. Does it matter? Does that have to do with what the finish is? No, it doesn't. The one exception, of course, is if you're stripping lead-based finishes. You don't sand lead-based finishes because it makes the lead airborne in the dust that you can breathe in, and that's a problem. So for lead-based finishes, we always strip them chemically, and we capture all the material so it doesn't become a contaminant any more than it already is.